If you want to understand Hollywood's attitude at large towards diversity and inclusion, then look no further than this moment from the 2020 Oscars, when Steve Martin and Chris Rock took the stage to roast the Academy for nominating barely any people of color. The Academy brought in two household Hollywood names to make fun of a problem that they created. They addressed the problem, talked about it to give the appearance of caring about it, but avoided any culpability. So, how bad is Hollywood's lack of racial diversity? According to the 2020 edition of UCLA's annual Hollywood Diversity Report, last year in 2019, only about 3 out of every 10 lead roles were given to people of color. That's 3 times as many as it was in 2011, where the number was about 1 out of every 10. Slow progress, but progress, I guess. However, behind the camera is a different story. In 2019, only 15% of film directors were minorities, down from 2018, where a whopping 19% of film directors were minorities. While in front of the camera, diversity has slowly been trending upward, behind the camera it has gotten slightly worse. According to USC's Inclusion in the Director's Chair study, quote, of the 113 directors of 2019, a full 83.2% were white, and 16.8% were underrepresented. Only 13.5% of all directors across the 13-year sample were from an underrepresented racial or ethnic group. At a certain point, Hollywood has to move beyond simple inclusion. Speaking for myself, I don't want South Asian people to just be included in different acting and on-set roles. I want South Asian people to have the power to create films and television about our community, our experiences, our culture, as well as films and television that may not be about the South Asian experience, but nevertheless employ and star people from underrepresented communities.
I don't want to be the Indian Steven Spielberg. I want the name Ishan Paramar. Ishan, another name for the Hindu god Shiva, and Paramar, the name of my father's family, a reminder of my family's history, to be known as widely as the name Steven Spielberg.
If we start putting people from underrepresented communities in power, if we start putting racial minorities, women, gay people, trans people in positions of power in the entertainment industry, then the gap in representation will be closed much more quickly because those people in power will seek out and support the production of stories and movies and TV that reflect their own experiences as well. In the current method of inclusion we have now, we have a system where, for example, racial minorities are left to prove that their stories are worth telling. I mean, look no further than Black Panther. This isn't a disservice to that movie's cultural significance, but Marvel was making superhero movies for almost a decade, directed by and starring white guys before they took a risk, and made Black Panther with an all-black cast and black director. Disney only started making superhero movies with diverse casts and above-the-line crews when they thought it would be profitable. Stories have always been an expression of the lives of the people that are telling them, and according to UCLA, just 14% of Hollywood feature film writers are people of color. If only 14% of writers are people of color, then audiences are going to see a very limited number of films about people of color. When there are no stories written for minorities, it makes it harder to cast minorities. It makes it harder to hire directors of color, because if there's nothing culturally specific about the script, it is easier for a studio to give the directing job to an already established director, who is probably going to be white, once again forsaking an opportunity to put a minority in a position of power. What further complicates the neglectful and passive nature of how Hollywood casts its films and crews its films and decides which films get made is that so many Hollywood filmmakers are great quality filmmakers whose work I enjoy. I love the work of people like Wes Anderson, Greta Gerwig, Noah Baumbach, and Richard Linklater, but their work is blindingly white. This is related to an issue that Hari Kondabolu raises in his documentary The Problem with Apu, an exploration of the Indian character Apu from The Simpsons. In an interview with Variety leading up to the release of the documentary, Kondabolu said, quote, "How often do you hear people say, that's not funny, it's offensive, as if those two things can't exist in the same space. If anything, something can be wrong and funny. And if it's funny, it's actually better. People are going to ignore the meaning of it because it made them laugh. When you don't laugh, you have to confront it for what it is." End quote. What made Apu so excusable for so long was that he was funny. People were laughing at him and at Indian people, but they were nevertheless laughing, so no one batted an eye at the character's offensive nature. In line with Kondabulu's logic, what has kept filmmakers like Wes Anderson and Greta Gerwig, Noah Baumbach, and Richard Linklater from serious criticism for their extremely white casts over the years has been the quality of their films. Their films are good and completely exclusive of any people of color. When reading the YouTube comments under the trailer for The Problem with Apu, one particularly struck me. Quote, "I'm an overweight, dumb, and lazy man, and I'm offended by Homer. Please remove him from the show." End quote. It's the idea that since every character on The Simpsons is a caricature, Apu should not be singled out.
But what this comment fails to recognize is that the reason no one is complaining about Homer being an overweight, dumb, and lazy white man is because white men have had more representation as heroes than everyone else. White men have been Indiana Jones, James Bond, and literally Jesus in movies. White men were the dashing stars of Hollywood's golden age. Not everyone thinks all white men are like Homer Simpson because of the abundance of roles there have been in the course of film and television history for white men. But when only one of the few Indian characters in the public consciousness is an immigrant with 8 kids that owns a convenience store, then that is the image created of Indian people in America. When children of color don't see themselves represented on screen, when all of the main characters in the TV shows and movies they watch are white, they start to think less of themselves. They start to think that they don't have a place on the big screen. They start to think that they cannot be the superheroes or doctors or presidents or writers or singers that they see on screen. They start to think that their stories don't have a place to be told. I know this because I went through it. I watched Disney Channel and Nickelodeon and never saw anyone that looked like me. I watched superhero movies in middle school and never saw anyone that looked like me. I watched Oscar-winning films in high school and never saw anyone that looked like me, and subconsciously believed that I didn't belong. Only in the past couple of years have I discovered the rich well of Indian and South Asian content that exists. And not just the wonderful Indian Americans in American entertainment, but classic Indian films like those of Satyajit Ray.
Nowadays, kids grow up watching influencers on TikTok and Instagram and YouTube, and I worry about them seeing these content houses that are often almost or exclusively white, and thinking to themselves that they cannot have the same large influence on these online platforms. People of color that are writers and creators are expected to be representatives for their entire culture. I myself have felt the pressure to write Indian stories instead of stories that have Indian people in them. But I realize that any story that has Indian people in it is an Indian story. My culture, my history, my parents' history, my experience being an Indian American is baked into any Indian American character that I write, of which I've been writing much more. I can write stories that are specifically about the struggle of being Indian American, but I can also write love stories and dark comedies and coming-of-age stories and fantasy movies with Indian people in them. In high school, growing up in a white town, I would always write race-neutral characters and then just end up casting white people. I didn't work hard enough to seek out actors that looked like me to tell stories that were often about me. So often in this industry, I hear from often experienced white people that nowadays diversity is essential, that you can no longer have a movie or a TV show where the cast is all white. But then I look around and see what's being made in Hollywood, and there are still many all-white casts and all-white creative teams. There are so few people of color that are directors and writers and showrunners compared to how many white people that are directors, writers, and showrunners. This is because the people in power in Hollywood do not mean it when they say diversity is essential. Craft services are essential. If you show up on a set and there isn't any food, everybody's gonna be pissed, and rightfully so. But if you show up on a set and there aren't a lot of or any people of color on the crew or in the cast, chances are no one will take notice, or at least no one will take action. Perhaps this is misguided, but I am not optimistic that Hollywood and the power holders in Hollywood right now will change themselves to create a more racially equitable industry. However, I am optimistic that creators of color will rise up and create a more racially equitable industry. I am optimistic that filmmakers of all different identities, racial, gender, sexual, will rise up and create an industry that embraces the stories of those who have never been able to tell their story. This may sound like a cheesy refrain, but it genuinely is up to the next generation of filmmakers, my generation of filmmakers, to change things. And I know that one day, we will.